Welcome to Tea Garden Talk, which is a lockdown special put on by gardenmasterclass.org. It's at 4 o'clock London time, Monday to Friday. Our normal business is putting on day workshops led by garden and landscape experts across the British Isles, and we're trying to organise in the Netherlands with occasional events in Germany and France. We're also now putting on pay-to-view webinars, which we're organising on a month-to-month basis. We do a regular newsletter, which at the moment we're bringing out every few weeks because of the rapidly changing situation. If you'd like to get our newsletter, please send us an email on gardenmasterclass@gmail.org, and that will stay very strictly with us. Tea Garden Talk itself is put on as a free service during lockdown, but we really appreciate donations to cover our running costs and time. If you'd like to donate, please go to the online page of our website. Thank you. Garden Masterclass and Tea Garden Talk are run by Annie Guilfoyle, who's based in Sussex in southern England, and Noel Kingsbury, based in central Portugal. So we look forward to seeing you and one day, hopefully, to meet you.
Connections with Chelsea, and really to sort of talk about Chelsea going forwards. Is Chelsea an outdated model, or is it, how could it be adapted? We welcome your questions, and by the way, if you want to ask questions, I'll introduce the panel in a second, but if you want to ask questions, please use the chat box. Everybody, I think, who's been tuning in is used to that, and we'll field questions to everybody. So who have we gathered together? Well, we have Duncan Coombes, who's in Worcestershire, and he's a lecturer at Sperl College and a horticulturalist. Hello, Duncan. We've got Christine Skelmersdale, who is in Somerset. That's right, isn't it, Christine? Yep. Somerset is the most beautiful county in England because it was where I was born. We have Ina Sperl, who's in Germany and near Cologne. And Ina is a journalist and will be giving us an opinion from an external point of view. And then there's Noel Kingsbury, who I think you've met before, who sat there in Portugal having a right old time, and there's me. So yes, so Noel,
James,
over to you.
Excuse me.
you forgot somebody.
Oh, right. That's it. I'm not hanging around.
That collection of
I didn't even deliberately do that. I mean, that's the sort of thing that I would have done, but I didn't even think to do that. James Alexander-Sinclair, who is the dearest, sweetest person I've ever known. James. No, I really didn't mean to do that, but it would have been funny if I did. Anyway, James, who sat there in Oxfordshire with a very impressive bookcase and a skull on his shelves. And James is on the RHS Council, aren't you, James?
I am.
Lovely.
Or as we call it sometimes, the Politburo.
And today you should have been walking around Chelsea in a rather dapper suit, I think, probably.
I should.
One of your wonderful hats.
Wandering around, giving feedback and kissing people, basically.
Yeah. Well, you can do that anyway. I'm sure everyone in your village. No, not at the moment. Perhaps not.
Yeah.
Okay.
Discouraged.
Anyway, welcome everybody. Welcome, James. Sorry, I forgot you.
Fine. One day I will forgive you, but not until I
Okay. Oh, somebody's asking, Ina Sperl, S-P-E-R-L, Angela. I've probably not pronounced it properly because my German is non-existent, probably.
Okay, Sperl.
Sperl. Okay, lovely. All right, Noel, over to you then.
Okay, this was my idea, I own up to this one, that I wanted to have some sort of fairly full and frank discussion about the Chelsea Flower Show. Perhaps I should just explain first of all that my own involvement, fairly small though it's been over the years. I first went to the Chelsea Flower Show when I was at school, 2 years running. A friend, another plant mad friend, and myself, we skived off some pointless Tuesday afternoon sporting activity to the Chelsea Flower Show. Which is a good story. And for 3 years, 1989 to 91, I had a small nursery stand in the Great Marquee during the period of my short-lived, but actually very important learning experience, little nursery near Bristol. What I want to do really today is to look at how effectively the Chelsea Flower Show celebrates British horticulture and garden design. And this is something in the nature of a j'accuse. So I am essentially prosecutor general here. How well does the Chelsea Flower Show do this? And perhaps we should be thinking about what else it should be doing and what are the alternatives. Now, for those of you who are outside outside Great Britain, perhaps a little bit of context here. The Chelsea Flower Show is put on by the Royal Horticultural Society, which is one of those organisations that you can moan about it every now and again. But if you woke up one morning and you realised the RHS didn't exist, you'd have to invent it straight away. Because it covers an enormous amount of ground, much of which it does in very, very well. Education, the gardens, publications, its a scientific research programme. It's essentially a charity, although I would argue sometimes it behaves more like a corporation. The shows have always been a very important of what the RHS does. But of course, the shows are, unlike an awful lot of other activities, very, very subject to the vagaries of fashion and weather and demography and changing patterns in mail order. And so they're much, much more vulnerable to change. And I think that's something that we need to bear in mind. So perhaps a little bit of history. The Chelsea Flower Show started in 2012, and for the vast majority of its history...
2012? 2012?
Sorry, 1912.
Right, yeah.
Its centenary was in 2012. So,
I told you to stop drinking the sherry. Yeah.
1912, and for most of that time, certainly the time when I had my little nursery stand there around about 1990, the core of the show has been the marquee. Okay, it's not a tent. It's not a tent, it's a marquee. And in that marquee, you had all these stands from nurseries with showing off their range of plants, and how it worked was that you would go along as a visitor and traditionally, you would place your orders for autumn delivery from those plants from the nurseries in the marquee. Over time, of course, the nursery industry has changed enormously, and the usefulness of Chelsea as a marketing tool for plants that whole market has changed. Also, the nature of nurseries has changed. That the nurseries of the past tended to be very much specialising in plants that work very well in that kind of tiered, rather kind of military formation. You think about the lupins, daffodils, delphiniums. A lot of these traditional garden flowers just look very good at that kind of format. The arrival of Beth Chatto in 1970 with a very different kind of display, with a very different kind of plants, perhaps was something of a challenge to the way that plants were displayed in the show. Now, around the outside of the Great Marquee, there were a few gardens. Particularly, I always remember a rock garden, a very elaborate rockery that would be built every year, and very much a sort of leftover from that huge importance of rockery gardens in the 20th century. But these show gardens were the sort of, they weren't the icing on the cake, they were simply a lesser part of the show. And really what happened from the 1990s onwards was that they began to take over. That boom in interest in garden design made the show gardens much, much more important. And it then became increasingly difficult and expensive for nurseries to exhibit. And Christine, I think, is going to be talking to us about that. So we end up with a situation where really an awful lot of the media attention is focused on the gardens. Except the trouble is the site is so small, it's actually very difficult to see the gardens. And really from the 1980s onwards, the problem of crowd control, of just how many people you can let into the site, became a major issue. And the garden has always been full of people who've complaining about, oh, I never go to Chelsea because I can't stand crowds. So I would argue that the site is simply too small. It no longer works to have nurseries coming to the marquee. The marquee feels half empty. The site is too small for show gardens. I think time to move on, find a bigger site, perhaps one, horror of horrors, outside London. Let the show grow. At the moment, I don't feel it represents British horticulture particularly well, and I don't think it represents garden design very well either, because you can't see the damn things. So that's my feeling about Chelsea. Annie, now you've had a show garden sort of 1990s as well?
1994, yes, yeah.
94.
In fact, I've just suddenly remembered that I should actually have been there judging this year. So I would have been one of those people carrying a clipboard and following James and doing what I was told. 1994, when I was a student, and it was probably the most terrifying thing I've ever done apart from my driving test. But it was a very, very different beast back then. And I know James exhibited probably the same year or just after me. And, those days, it wasn't the media frenzy that it is now. In fact, all you had on TV was an extra half an hour on Gardener's World on a Friday night. So Gardener's World was a whole hour in length instead of half an hour, because that half an hour was Chelsea, instead of the probably 2, if not sometimes 3 programs a day that are broadcast now on the BBC. And actually that is a really good way to physically see the show, because you can get the most amazing views and you can see into the gardens. My experience, because I was a student, I was terrified. I was doing it on an absolute shoestring next to some gardens that were doing it on a very, very large shoestring. And it was a baptism of fire. And so much so that I just thought, I'm never doing this again. And then I thought about maybe 10 or 15 years ago, I might give it another go. I've probably forgotten how terrifying it was. And then, of course, it was a very, very different, from a designer's point of view, a very different beast. So getting sponsorship, and this is, let's say 10 or 15 years ago, before the banks and various people sort of have dropped out, getting sponsorship is very, very competitive, and quite tricky. And I got very close on a couple of occasions, but it didn't happen. And I sort of was slightly relieved in a way, I think. From a designer's perspective, Chelsea for me, it's a big social occasion. You can't get away from the fact it's the meeting of people, and I'm very fortunate to go on press day and have done for the last how long. And it's very much about everybody meeting and getting together, and you can't walk 4 yards without seeing someone you haven't seen since the year before. And so I think the gardens have changed a lot in the last half a dozen years. And that's a lot to do with sponsorship. I think it's now building up again in terms of the different sponsors, the different sizing of the gardens. I've got a few ideas about the whole space thing, which I can talk about later, but that might help. But it really is, it's a sort of a love-hate thing, and I think there's this wonderful sense of the beginning of the sort of horticultural year, and everyone coming together, and all the stories and the excitement. And so that would be hard to lose. I think that would be hard to lose. I think it's a very once bitten, you are really sort of you want to be involved in some way. And so what I think I feel most sad about now when I visit Chelsea is the marquee. I remember going into the marquee, 20 years ago, 30 years ago, and you couldn't see the other side of the marquee. It was like being in a TARDIS. It was so packed full of nurseries, you couldn't see the edges, so it felt enormous. And I think that the saddest thing for me is, over the last few years, seeing the marquee, the nursery people who used to exhibit, dwindling away, so much so that other things have entered into the marquee, sort of trade stand type things, and even a sort of bar or cafe, and it just seems rather sad. And I'm sure Christine will talk a little bit about that. And because there are people who go to look at the plants at Chelsea, and the word goes around that you've got to go and look at certain stand and certain plants. And there are certain people who go for the gardens, and I think that people kind of divide into two halves. But the marquee is second to none. And I used to go a lot to the London shows, which used to be held once a month in Vincent Square years ago. And they were absolutely amazing because you could talk to the nursery people, you could buy plants, you had time, you had space. They were seasonally linked. You walk in January and it was full of hamamelis and it was just amazing. But they have almost disappeared too. So it's that dwindling that I'm worried about. It's the dwindling, it is the size thing. It is about, it is an amazing focus. It's a wonderful place for designers to cut their teeth and to get exposure and to get media and press attention. As an educator of designers, I do worry sometimes that they think show gardens are the be all and end all, and show gardens are really pure theatre. So I wonder how much emphasis there should be on show gardens, and that they should be kept in perspective a little bit. And then the sustainability, which I know the RHS has really tried to sort of clamp down on. So those are my feelings at the moment, and I'm not inclined to want to exhibit there again because I think it is. I think you really do have to give up a huge amount of your time as a designer, months and months of your time at a very crucial time of year. And I think if you're a person that works on their own or in a small design studio, you've got to think really hard about it. So I've very mixed feelings, but I've, very fond feelings too.
Right. So thank you, Annie. So now, Christine, you've run Broadleaf Gardens and you exhibited at Chelsea for many years. And I've always thought of you as being one of that little sort of handful of specialist nurseries that make British horticulture, I think, really special. And that Chelsea and RHS shows were an important showplace for your range of plants. How have you seen the show change in terms of your business over the years?
I'm going to give you a whole complete background of the history. I mean, I did 40 Chelsea flower shows.
40.
40. 40. 40. I know I'm old. Our first Chelsea exhibit was back in 1973. The world was a very different place. Members of the fellows, they had 2 private viewing days, many wore hats, and there was even a society photographer at the gate.
Wow.
The show lasted 4 days. Gradually the displays evolved, and Beth Chatto certainly had tremendous influence on how we started putting stands together. And I possibly would question all that, because we suddenly had to turn into artists and not horticulturalists. Originally we were judged on the quality of our plants. We weren't judged on how much moss we'd managed to dig up from the local wood and turn into a lovely, pretty display, which is a little bit contentious issue, but I think there is an element there about that I worry about. And the show opened at 8. People queued in the marquee. Those crowds, there were no show gardens, no television. People queued. You could hardly move between the stands. Health and safety have now doubled the width of the marquee stand. I stood and took orders from 8 in the morning till 8 at night. People queued. Someone had 10 people queuing to place an order. That was the traditional thing. I was showing you a plant in its flowering season. You ordered it to go out at the right time for planting. Then, as Noel said, 1990s, everything changed. The biggest decision you haven't made, and I was actually on RHS Council at the time, was that the RHS decided to take on the struggling Hampton Court Flower Show. That was a very different concept. Here the exhibitors still had to build the display to the same high standard, but they could also buy a selling space alongside, which meant instant gratification for the visitor, but fewer future orders. Chelsea had to continue as a largely non-selling show. There was no space to change this, but there were alternatives. I'm not saying we should try and turn Chelsea into something like Hampton Court. We've got Hampton Court. Chelsea is different. Now, for the exhibitor, small exhibitors like me, the costs were rising. The show, for health and safety reasons, to cap the number of people in the marquee, had to extend by a day to 5 days. This meant that you now had a minimum of 10 consecutive days to build and staff your stand. 2 weekends of overtime. And for small nurseries, trying to find volunteers to cover the breaks in a 12-hour day. All my friends come in to do lunchtime so my poor staff could have a break. Who can do a 12-hour day? I can't employ people to do that. Costs were rising. Hotel and transport costs were going up. And the extension also meant for me, who I sell spring bulbs, I sell daffodils and tulips. So my display was daffodils and tulips. And when you do that, they had the problem that of extra fifth day, the plants are beginning to go over fast. A daffodil that's been in cold store for 2 months comes out on a Saturday, and you put it into the marquee, which is hot. And who forgets those old marquees with a flapping canvas tent and the wretched intrusive tent poles, which we hated trying to work around those tent poles. The modern pavilions are so much better with ventilation. And you brought the plant in. In 2 days, it had grown 2 inches. Daffodils were growing 2 inches a day, which meant by the end of the show, I had to try and replenish my stand, which meant yet another journey up from the cold store to put new plants on the stand, another cost. Now, alongside this, selling shows were opening more and more around the country. The RHS was expanding its portfolio of selling shows, which are wonderful, and visitors started saying, no, thank you, won't order, I will look for it at Hampton Court, Malvern, Gardens World Live, wherever. And our order book started to literally dive. And the final nail in the coffin for the small exhibitor, I'm afraid, was the advent of the digital camera and the iPad. No longer did people want a catalogue. I used to sell 2,000. They wouldn't even take a price list. I got rid of over 3,000. Now they took a picture of the plant and its label and said, I'll find it online, which means we were turned into an expensive shop window for other companies to spend their money. So to sum up, our final gold medal exhibit, which is the biggest we ever did, with masses of TV coverage, a prime location in the marquee, our income was only equal to that of 20 years previously. But our costs had dramatically doubled, if not quadrupled. They'd actually met in the middle. It was no longer profitable. It didn't even make sense to do Chelsea. So is it any wonder that the smaller nurseries like me concentrate our efforts on the showings, the selling shows? We have to. But that's not to say Chelsea should be discontinued. I'm not sure I agree that it's to celebrate the best of British horticulture. There are elements of that. But it's different today, but for the visitor, in many ways, it remains the same. It always was and still is a fantastic spectacle. And that's what people go for. A great friend of mine had never been, and last year for a birthday present, her husband sent her to Chelsea. And she came up to me, open-mouthed. It's wonderful. I've never seen anything like it, she said. That's what it's all about. The discerning gardener knows they can go to these selling shows out in the countryside and see things. But the big nurseries are still there. You can still go and see the best of the new roses, the new tulips, the wonderful shrubs, and in fact the clematis. Those big displays are still there. And the one thing I think you've all mentioned is television. When we started television, there was very little coverage, and it was mostly in the marquee. Then the RHS was given sponsorship by various television companies, and they wanted to make programs which were every single night, justify their sponsorship. We needed the money, they needed to make the programs. And of course, they concentrated on the big showpiece ones, which were the gardens. So 90% of the television coverage was on the gardens, sorry, James, and the people stopped thinking about the marquee. The marquees are empty. You go in at 8 o'clock, you can say, I won't see a customer till 12 o'clock. 4 hours, they're all queuing outside to see James's garden. Come into the marquee, there are huge galleyways now, we have to, health and safety reasons. You can go and look around, really look at every plant. You can talk to the exhibitors. You can ask them the questions you want to know, ask advice about which plant to buy, which tulip, what's the new this, the new that. There's so much to do. You can really see it. And I think moving, there's no point in moving Chelsea. It either stops. If you move it, it will not be Chelsea. It'll be Hampton Court somewhere else or Malvern somewhere else. Chelsea is what it is. We need to make it this wonderful spectacle and not get people's expectations that they're going to buy plants. They can see and order, but not buy. Sorry, no, that's me. I think you've turned yourself.
Yeah. Thank you, Christine. That was fantastic. I mean, great to hear. There's such a experience. I think perhaps over to Duncan now. You mentioned the Malvern show, Christine, which a lot of us love. I mean, you've got a fantastic backdrop of the Malvern Hills. You've got space. How do you feel? Yes.
Well, yeah. Thank you, Christine, first for taking me down memory lane. It was lovely to hear those experiences of you. I haven't been going for, I don't know how many years, it was quite a long time, but I've been going like the London shows. I remember of those. Been going to those since I was about 20, which is quite a long time ago. And mentioning the Malvern Spring show, I must have been going there and working for the RHS part of the time for, I should think, at least the last 20 years. And that's changed a lot in that time. It's become a lot bigger, certainly. We now have the Malvern Autumn Show on the same site as well. And that's getting bigger as well. As to the nature of the show, perhaps comparing it with, say, Chelsea, the spring show is very big. It's very commercially driven, I think that's fair to say, and very, very popular usually. The Malvern Autumn Show, as I've said, is smaller, but it still has a very good function, I think. Not only is it a show, it's a meeting place. And a lot of professional horticulturalists and amateur gardeners, and I mean that in the best sense of the word, they come, and it's sort of a hello and goodbye before winter sort of thing. It has a very good atmosphere, and I think they're both very good. As Noel quite rightly said, there's so much more space there. And I think it's true to say that the emphasis is changing, not so much as at Chelsea, but the garden design aspect and the gardens themselves are gradually becoming more important. I think it's worth saying also, in thinking of the past, and we can perhaps toss this into the argument as well, that I've been with the RHS a long time, and I can remember when we used to go to a much wider range of shows. Now, whether this one's earring as well, I mean, it's partly financial, but maybe not, because I used to go to things like the Royal Welsh Show, the Shrewsbury Show, the Bristol Show, and I think the RHS was present at a lot more of the regional shows as well. And over the last few years, Chris mentioned the start of Hampton Court, and gradually the RHS has built up this very good portfolio of its own shows up and down the country. Now, to say something controversial, are they everywhere they should be? But I could say, should they start going to these other shows as well, and perhaps spreading the message of the RHS and what it's all about a bit more widely? That's something we haven't really spoken about, perhaps. What is the function of the RHS, as well as what it actually, does physically? What is its role? I don't know. It's perhaps worth also talking about the regional shows and what they offer to people generally. Obviously, they publicise the RHS, but talking about the RHS and its development, it's doing a lot more work, I think most people know, in sort of schools activities, subsidising sort of greening operations up and down the country. It's becoming a lot more involved in education, generally speaking. And that also impacts on the shows as well. At certainly Malvern, and I believe at Chelsea, you have children's gardens, you have things done by children. The whole idea of trying to make garden more across the age range to get more people involved. I think that's a good thing. We could develop that a bit more. And I'm just trying to think other things about your point on garden design, Noel, and its importance. Something that we haven't mentioned, and I wonder if you remember this, Noel. A few years ago, there was actually just a purposeful garden design show that started at Westonbirt. Now, do you remember that, Noel?
Yes, that's another model, isn't it? It was
it's another model, yes.
Yes.
And whether we want
model on the garden show at Chaumont-sur-Loire, which is, had been very successful over a long period, arguably within a particular kind of French cultural context. And I know the organisers of the Western Birch Garden Show, which was a summer-long event, it was a very brave attempt, but they didn't seem to sort of be able to kind of really break through, did they?
Well, I think it was, I don't know, I'm not principally a garden designer, although I am interested in garden design. And I think those of you that are garden designers are familiar with it, perhaps it's a little bit too ahead of its time, do you think, Noel? I mean, it was very avant-garde. It was
very avant-garde. It was very much focused on a particular type of garden design, which was, conceptual, which was where garden design merges into installation art. And for a lot of people, that does lack credibility. I remember
it certainly did then, I think. Yes. Yeah, perhaps not so much.
For example, I mean, that Candice Behuth, that wonderful mosaic artist who created this incredible garden with plastic flowers. Yes, great. That belongs in an art gallery. It's not something that.
Yeah.
Because one of the sort of slogans of Chaumont-sur-Loire event was ideas to steal. These are ideas you can, however arty they are, you can actually take back to your own garden. So I think that is a very valid question of why that kind of show hasn't worked in Britain. I mean, it has arguably not been.
Well, I would say it hasn't worked in the past. But if we're looking at the development of shows now, then perhaps its time has come. And perhaps people as old as myself, when we went to the Western Birch Show, you'd hear the comment things like, "This isn't gardening. What has this got to do with gardening?" I think that kind of comment would be a lot less prevalent today.
Yes.
And it may be worth reconsidering. Is that enough, Noel? I've given you
that's great. Some great perspectives there. And I think it's very interesting you bring up the Western Birch Show. Now, I think we should, perhaps we should hear from Ina about how things operate in Germany, and then move on to talking to James Alexander-Sinclair. Now, in Germany, you've got a very, very different show model. So, Ina, could you outline what happens in Germany?
Well, we have large central Bundesgartenschauen. There are garden shows which are biannually, so every second year in a city, and they are subsidized by the government, and the council has to also put in some money, and they're basically large development projects for areas or city areas or old industrial sites. And I think they're a bit difficult to compare to Chelsea because they also have this show part, but it's very small because we are speaking of long-term projects which will take several years to be finished and to be used by the people. And the show part is also always a few months, and it's more or less the icing on the cake, I would say. So it's a very different project.
And there's a certain number of smaller events, aren't there? Like I remember going to the Freisinger Gartentage many years ago, which was.
So we don't only have the Bundesgartenschau, we have them also in the federal states. We have smaller shows like this, but we also have tiny Chelseas, I would say, without show gardens, which are the garden festivals, like in Munich or in Ippenburg or in smaller towns. And this is what I think is a bit more comparable, because there are plant shows, and these are the places where the experts meet, where you want to find new plants or plants for difficult sites. There you can meet the experts and the growers and talk with the people. And the Bundesgartenschauen are rather development projects, and I think they're missing out the chance to use them they don't put enough focus on the horticulture, I think.
Yes.
Can I just interject a question? Inga, do they have displays in the same way as we do at Chelsea, where a nursery actually builds a permanent display with these flowers?
No, we don't have this. You mean at the smaller garden festivals? Yes. No, they're just the normal, where they're nicely arranged plants. But the Bundesgartenschau, with those festivals, they have plantings that sometimes last for many years, but the show effect is only for maybe 1 year. So
if I can say, yeah, if I can, sorry, can I come for a second? It seems to me that the Bundesgarten idea was, if you're familiar with the old idea we had of the garden festivals.
That's right.
Where again we take a site. I think Liverpool was perhaps
Liverpool, Gateshead as well as Scotland.
Yeah,
which was a concept that I don't think it particularly worked in Britain because we don't have them anymore.
We don't have them anymore. No.
I think we should perhaps now turn to James, who's been keeping very quiet. Where is he? I think perhaps we should get James's perspective. Hello, James.
Yeah, no, I've unmuted. It's okay. I'm back in.
Yes. So obviously, to some extent, you always wear very stylish hats, but you're the sort of imaginary RHS hat on your head at the moment.
Yes, no, very firmly, I do. I mean, it's interesting to hear. There's been a lot of stuff that's been said. And the world changes. The world changes unbelievably fast, and Chelsea has to change with it. And if we don't keep up, then it will indeed disappear. I mean, there are a few things that need to be understood at the beginning. And the first thing to be understood at the beginning is the purpose of Chelsea. So as you said, the RHS is a charity. The purpose of Chelsea is in order to generate income, in order that the RHS can do all the other things that we do on the other 51 weeks of the year. So there is an awful lot of money that is made at that point that is then spent on science and education and all the things that you mentioned before. So that is pretty much its primary purpose, is to help to finance the charity. The secondary purpose is obviously to help horticulture in every way that it possibly can, and that is with nursery people wherever it can be within. I think it's actually not a tent or a marquee. I think it's a pavilion. If I might correct you just at that point. It is a pavilion.
I named it.
It used to be a marquee in the good old days.
It was a marquee when it was a tent. Then it was a sort of ex-army issued canvas thing that smelled nice in the morning. So it's not a simple thing, Chelsea. It's a very complicated thing, and it has this idea that it has to be glamorous and spectacular and theatrical, and at the same time it's supposed to promote what the RHS does. And another purpose of it is in order to raise money so that the RHS can do more of the things that they actually do. And there is an awful lot of work and effort and thinking and time and talking that goes into how Chelsea can remain relevant to everybody. So the things that people have pointed out, which is obvious, is that I remember when my first Chelsea, I think it was in 1987 or something like that. And there were show gardens, but they were mostly nursery show gardens. And there was a rock garden, and there were two people who used to build a rock garden on alternate years, and they used to basically flog rock gardens. I mean, I don't know where they are now, but there was a couple of people. It was Dougie Knight and another one whose name I've temporarily forgotten. Anyway, they basically used to build rock gardens, and there wasn't a lot of gardens going on at that time. Then it changed, as Annie pointed out, and my first show garden was in 1999. At that point, Channel 4 was doing the television. And it sort of became quite a thing. The fact that there was television, and the television gave designers and nurseries and such like more coverage, it gave them more publicity, and it became a slight monster of its own creation, but a really, really important one, because it enabled many, many more people to actually see the show and to see the gardens and to see the plants and to be part of Chelsea than it was before. Before that, it was pretty much an elitist place. And that you would go there with your head gardener and go to see Christine and buy a whole load of stuff, and it would be fabulous. But life is no longer like that, sadly. Very few of us, apart from Noel, obviously have more than one gardener in our gardens. And it's just the way that the world changes. And we have noticed, the RHS have noticed that, since probably the last recession, 2008 up to 2012, yes, people have been leaving the marquee. Have been leaving the pavilion because it is an expensive place to be, and the RHS have noticed this. I mean, one of the problems is the fact that But the nurseries that were there, the smaller nurseries, it is really difficult for them to support themselves anyway. There are so many places where you can buy plants now. There are so many bigger places. You can buy them online. You can do all sorts of things. So the idea of going to Chelsea and taking notes and writing down what you're going to order in the autumn is obviously, way gone, because people want it now and they want it delivered to their house tomorrow. And they don't want to do that. And there is simply no space at Chelsea for people to sell plants. It is, it's an 11-acre site or something ridiculous like that. It's the same size as the wall garden that we're doing up at Bridgewater at the moment. And so it's tiny. And into that, we have to pack an awful lot of stuff. And there has to be, gardens, because people want gardens. People like show gardens. Yes, I think that Annie's thing of there being a division between people who want to see gardens and people who want to see plants is not strictly speaking fair, because there's a huge mixture who want to see both and want to see everything. And the show gardens themselves are the theatre. They are the sort of big show off, bada bing, look at this, amazing things. And there is some people will come along and say, oh, well, it's unrealistic. And other people will come along and say, well, it's not really supposed to be. It's supposed to be extraordinary and wonderful, and garden designers at the peak of their ability, showing off what they can do. One of the things, whoops, says he, waving a pencil at you. One of the things that we have tried to do, and I think that we are beginning to succeed, is to tweak the judging system of gardens so they can't get away with the things that they maybe used to be able to get away with. And that if you put your plants in as flower arranging because they look nice together, but at the same time you're putting, an eryngium next to a hosta, you're going to get hammered for that now. Whereas
that is an interesting development, because certainly that's been said to me in the past. Oh, the Chelsea Flower Show is actually about flower arranging. And actually, one of the comments that's come up on the chat box is, I'm interested in the judges versus the public opinion. Best in shows frequently are more challenging, conceptual, but more often than not, the People's Choice Award goes to something more relatable, and the two awards rarely coincide.
Yeah, and there's a very good and sensible reason for that. In that if you or I, or you and I and Annie and Christine are going to judge a garden, it's not about what any of us like. And that's what's really important, because otherwise you go and stand in front of a garden and I say, I like this. And you say, well, I don't, I like that. So what are we going to do? What are we going to do for it? So that, the idea of like, if anybody says, I like something during the process of judging a garden, we tell them to go and wash their mouths out with soap immediately, because you can't do it. And so the way that the whole criteria have been arranged is so it is a scientific decision that is done by going through so you're looking at the design, the two-dimensional, three-dimensional design, looking at the way that the garden is built, you're looking at the way that it's planted, the textures, the health of the plants, whether they're horticulturally correct. All of this sort of stuff is done as a panel of 7, and there's lots of arguments and lots of discussions, and we have a glorious time doing it. But it is done scientifically. When you are voting for something for People's Choice, the people stand in front of the garden and say, oh, I like this. I love this, I would like to have this. And that is the different thing. And that is why there is almost always a difference between one and the other. So we are judging it professionally and succinctly and scientifically, whereas the people who are voting for People's Choice are judging it with their hearts. And that's
head versus heart. Yes.
Yeah. And it has to be like that, because if we judge by heart, then it becomes completely wrong, because it's what I like against what Annie likes.
And James, Duncan mentioned Westonbirt, and of course you have exhibited at Westonbirt, didn't you?
I was at Westonbirt 2004, and then the funding was withdrawn by the Forestry Commission, and that was the end of that. Basically, is what happened with that. But it lasted for 3 years. It was fun. It was nice. It was 3 months long, and the gardens used to grow and all that kind of stuff. But it's a really expensive thing, because you've got 10 gardens that have to be looked after and kept at a standard the whole way through. The awful thing about it is that people think that gardens are not susceptible to things, but they are susceptible to fashion, and they are susceptible to finance. And it is it's the way of the world. And it would be lovely if the government were going to chip in like they do in Germany and do things, but they ain't, particularly now, because they've spent it all and more. And I
can empathise a lot with what James is saying there, because I used to work at Pershall College. We used to exhibit, and like a lot of other people, we pulled out because of the funding. issue. That's, James is quite right. It's all about money at the end of the day. If I could chip in though, and taking up Chris's point about nurseries as well, I'm sort of no, what's the word, IT expert or particularly au fait in that, but I do feel there must be an opportunity for a lot of the nurseries that operate very much on sales online to perhaps publicise more their new varieties, because that's what they have, which should be unique to them. And, you know, a marketing person should surely pick up Chelsea and say, this is an opportunity. What do you think, James? Has that been done to death, or was there more opportunity there?
There is huge opportunity. The main problem is that an awful lot of the nurseries at any of the shows are quite small operations. You know, they're sort of 2 people and or something like that. They're a family operation, and the problem with a family nursery is that it may well support mum and dad, but when little Johnny and Joanna suddenly want to come into the business, and they have children of their own, suddenly this tiny nursery is supporting 4 families, and it doesn't work like that. It's really difficult for that to happen. I mean, the RHS. We are making, when I say we, the RHS are making huge efforts in order to try and support it. And Helen Bowen, who's our sort of nursery manager, is looking for nurseries all year round and trying to support them in any way. We pay bursaries. You get, I think, 500 quid or something for a gold medal, and we pay travel expenses, or contribution to travel expenses, and all of this sort of stuff in order to help as much as possible, as much as we can. We try and put them into as many good publicity situations as possible, but they have to work themselves. And the main problem is the fact that people who grow plants are possibly not the most savvy people in marketing and PR and all of that kind of stuff.
Absolutely,
As and when we can, and we will say, right, what have you got? We have this thing at Pershaw in February where all the nurseries come, all the nurseries.
Correct, you did,
place, and the BBC are there, and they say, okay, what are the stories? What have you done? What have you got? Give us something which we can make a film out of. There are various people who come to that particular place, and we're there to all try and help and try and give the nurseries hints, give them tips, give them ways that they can do. Say, why don't you speak to this person? Why don't you do that? What about your social? I mean, I did a whole workshop on social media presence and all of this kind of stuff. So we're trying very, very hard in order to promote nurseries. There are nursery bursaries to get new, young, exciting nurseries into the pavilion at Chelsea and to all the other shows. There are new shows that are being developed in all of the RHS gardens now have plant fair shows as well, in order that
absolutely,
So all of this effort is being made in many, many ways. And as regards gardens, the most important thing that is basically facing gardens at the moment is sponsorship. So it's back to money again, and it's like Annie saying, you nearly got this one. No, so many people have nearly got the sponsorship.
Coming back, can I just come back? I think there's another point there, James. Thinking about the problems that the small nurseries certainly have, could they, if they've got a new variety, could they not work with some of the large retail supplying nurseries? And, the big nurseries would take them under their wing.
Wherever they wish to work.
It's totally unrealistic. If you've got a new plant, in order to work with one of the big people, you need to produce hundreds of thousands of that plant. Most small nurseries can't do that. And if they do, they're taking an enormous financial risk. The other thing that James said, which I think is absolutely right, there are these wonderful other shows which the RHS is sponsoring. We really appreciated the money to get us to the show, but you are not going to change the order book at Chelsea, especially talking about Chelsea. The other shows is where I go because that's where I can sell the plants. But Chelsea, I can't. I'm reliant on marketing my plants at Chelsea. I said my last Chelsea, we had hours of television coverage. We had the Queen, we had everybody there. But our order book was still a fraction of what we needed to break even.
Yes, but Chris, if you were selling things that were unique, and you had a bigger hang on a minute, and you had a bigger sort of...
You had to find a unique plant. You're telling me to sell something that's unique. I have my irises, which are totally unique to us. We have a big display of these. But the best one in the world, people are still not going to place an order at Chelsea.
No, but if you had a big presence on your website, they're buying plants. Yeah, well, that's where they tend to buy more and more plants, and that's what we should be doing.
To me,
Could we sort of, yes.
Okay.
Move on a little here. And I think
No keyboarder.
I think over to back to Ina again. You've described, Ina, how the German system is actually very, very different, and it's about a kind of actually urban regeneration as much as anything, which is a kind of social and landscape remit, which is something that is, Chelsea and RHS shows have never really been about. What opportunities are there in Germany to see something like show gardens for ordinary people who want to see good quality garden design? What places, what can they see at garden shows or indeed at other events?
Well, to see show gardens, we would go to Chelsea, I think. Well, in some of the garden shows, they sometimes have small show gardens, but it's really not the focus at all.
No.
So, seeing gardens.
Didn't we go to something together once? Something near Cologne where there was some show garden.
It was Tulpich, that was a Landesgartenschau.
Yes.
In our federal state, the small Gartenschau, but they were taken down after a few years because I think they stayed for a year, maybe a year and a half.
Mm-hmm. But at least during that year, people had the opportunity to go along and see the work of so and so.
You could, of course.
Yes.
Sometimes you have a chance to see gardens, but it's really like you saw it. It's not really comparable to Chelsea because it's almost a tiny site and much different budget than Chelsea. You wouldn't put millions in there. I don't think it's very good to compare this.
You can't make the comparison. No. And we had
gardens for a minute.
Can we talk about gardens?
Yes. Can I just talk because there is this very important thing which is basically is why they're there, how they're there, what are there, and all that kind of all of that kind of thing. And it is all of this is changing quite radically because it is driven to a certain extent by sponsors, and I think that sponsors are looking for a different thing, and I also think that the RHS are actively seeking a different thing. The sustainability issue is something that we need to address. And I think that the best Chelsea gardens are the ones that have a home to go to after they have gone. So all they're doing is just stopping off at Chelsea on the way. Sorry, telephone, don't ignore it. Somebody else wants it. On the way somewhere else. So they're just sort of hanging around at Chelsea, being glamorous and being patted and being stroked. Before they clear off somewhere else and become something that is part of the community and part of the wider world.
Yes.
So it used to be when I did my garden in 1999, I remember at the end of the show, a digger came along, dug up the whole thing and put it in a skip.
Yes. In fact, we've had one of the questions on the.
It went straight. It doesn't happen like that anymore. I think there's something along in the region of 98% of everything, from rubbish to garden stuff that goes to that comes out of Chelsea, is recycled in some way or other. So old concrete gets crushed up and used in roads, and everything has this sort of way of doing it. And we have to be really, really important, really vigilant about that. The other thing that's important to know about gardens is that the RHS can only select from what is submitted. And people think, I need to be. You don't need to be invited to come to the RHS. Anybody, anywhere in the world can put in an application for a garden at one of the RHS shows. All you do basically is either fill in the form on the website or just ring the shows department and say, I have an idea. And then that will be regarded, selected. If it has some money behind it, that would be even better. But there's also the RHS now have this way where we are trying to be a marriage bureau between designers and sponsors, because sponsors occasionally ring the shows department and say, we want to do a garden. Who do we talk to? Who do we speak to? And obviously the answer is don't speak to any Guilfoyle. Whatever happens, it'll be disastrous.
Never see your money again. An interesting question has come up from Tyler Scary. Has there been any discussion about taking Chelsea abroad, i.e. in mini Chelseas in other countries, or are there already sufficient fairs and festivals elsewhere? So, RHS going global, franchising the concept.
Let's there's quite a lot of work for us to do in this country.
It actually was tried in America when I was on council. There was active discussion There's a huge row about the trademarking the name Chelsea.
Yeah.
Because someone did actually try to take a new Chelsea across to America and run a Chelsea flower show in America, and there was enormous complications.
It's a really, Chelsea is such a valuable thing. We need to be very careful where it goes and what happens to it. So yes, there's endless discussions. It was always something that is that I think that the RHS are open to talking to people about. But really, what we're trying to do is to try and if you boil it down, the RHS is a British-based horticultural charity. We are there in order to help people to garden better in many, many different ways. And we do that by putting on shows, which means people can see the very best of garden design, where they can come and see the most wonderful nurseries. We put them places where they can actually buy plants, they can buy lawnmowers, all of this sort of stuff that sort of comes with it. We have ways to educate them and to teach their children the value of gardens, not just of having their own gardens, but the value of public gardens, which is really important, the value of gardens for people's mental health and well-being, which is particularly important, particularly now, and how will that, that's a whole new subject to go on to.
Yes,
we've hardly developed that at all, have we really? No.
Another subject, that's an excellent subject for another future panel, I think. The wellness agenda.
James, Neil Johnson wants to know who the biggest sponsors are at the moment, now that the banks have moved away. Who would you say the biggest sponsors are?
Well, it sort of varies and depends. M&G is still looking after it, which is very sort of kind. There are other people. What we're trying to do is to try and show people out there that sponsoring a garden is a good thing to do, because they're going to look at it as a business proposition. What are we going to get? What are we going to get out of sponsoring a garden? So there are a number of things that you can get. In that, if this is a garden that then has a future destination, then your international company is, or your company is getting a warm fuzzy feeling by helping whoever that person is via being publicised themselves being at Chelsea. So I think that the way that we're moving is less. Yes, it's about this bank and it's about very rich people and it's about this elitism thing, is to try and appeal to people's social consciences to a certain extent. In that if you, as Guilfoyle Finance PLC, want to publicise yourself, then a really good way of doing that is to show that you are good people. And you're doing this by sponsoring a garden at Chelsea that will then be recited at a community garden in wherever it is. And the RHS have done that themselves, in that the garden that Anne-Marie designed in 2016 was rebuilt at a place called the Angel Estate in Brixton. And so it's taking things from Chelsea, and an awful lot of them. Cleve West's garden for Bupa went to a hospital. I think Joe's garden for the Teenage Cancer Trust went, everything is trying to go somewhere else. Usually it sometimes gets cut into bits and bits get sent to one place or the other. So the answer, who is the biggest sponsor? I don't know. When people ring me up and say, I want to do a garden at Chelsea, who should I ring up for sponsors? The answer is ring up everybody. I feel that there is more room for retailers rather than financial organizations, so people who are actually selling things directly to the public rather than selling commodities to a few people.
Well, and certainly at the moment, gin companies. Gin is
good.
Like that.
Gin gardens and Seedlip, the sort of non-alcoholic gin. They had a couple of gardens. There's all sorts of ways of looking at it, and there are new people who've been employed at the RHS whose job is to try and match all these things together and try and get as many people as possible. Because again, it comes back, what we want an awful lot of gardens from which we can select the best.
Yeah, that's what's. I think there's 2 points I'd like to pick up, if I may, just before we move on. This transferability is really good. I think it's a really great idea and it's sustainable and that. But I do think that we need to look carefully, that's the RHS, at where these gardens are and the subsequent looking after them. Because I have seen some of these gardens, I shan't mention names, but the maintenance has been very sadly lacking. Yeah. And perhaps you wouldn't want to call it an RHS garden anymore, because it hasn't been. So that aspect needs looking at, where it's going and how it's going to be looked after. And just going back a little bit in the previous part of the conversation about doing things internationally, when I used to work for the college, we did actually exhibit in Japan. And what I learned was it's quite difficult because you haven't got the context that we have in England, that gardening is not seen in the same light in Japan. I think it's slightly different in Germany as well, where there's a different concept of what gardening is about, really, I think, in Germany. So it's not very easy to just say, take Chelsea or a Chelsea lookalike and put it in Tokyo or put it in Berlin.
It just then becomes an exotic foreign object.
Yeah, exactly.
Yes,
Yes,
Japanese.
it's not an easy thing to do.
Yes.
James, there's an interesting question here from Linda, who's saying, what costs are involved and expected for sponsors, and do they have any influence? And I guess they mean over the design, but she means over the design.
Yeah, I'm sure that they have an influence over the design, but the very best gardens at any show are not too corporate. The best sponsors, what they will do is they will say, design me something brilliant, design me something that is amazing, and then their company will then be associated with something that is amazing. I mean, if you look at all the M&G gardens, look at Andy Sturgeon's garden last year, for example, which was sponsored by M&G, didn't really say M&G on the garden anywhere, which is perfect. What it was an exquisite garden, and then they then associate their name with something exquisite. I've seen other gardens which have been ruined by the fact that sponsors have insisted on slapping logos all over it.
Yes,
that sort of spoils it and ruins it. So really, a light touch is best. What you need to do as a sponsor is associate yourself with excellence, but allow the people who design the gardens to do the garden designing. Because what the hell is the point of employing a garden designer and designing the garden yourself? Otherwise, you end up with a dog's dinner that's been designed by a stockbroker, and who the hell wants that?
Yes.
What we used to have.
I'm going to be really content to say, why don't we turn the whole of Chelsea into gardens? Forget the pavilion altogether. If you're
That's certainly one possible.
Why don't we have it?
No, I don't think it is at all. I think that plants and it's really, really, really important. It's an important part. Yes, it is diminishing. It's not
being contentious.
It's not as crowded as it was.
You've been successful, Christy. That's very contentious, I think, really. I think James was saying that most people that I think go to Chelsea go for the gardens and, importantly, they go for the plants, and long may that continue. I think the blend is vital.
My point is very much in a way, perhaps we can't have both.
You can have both. I think it may not be
on that site. That so much does come down to the site. Interesting point here. From Darren Hurlin, have the RHS considered running the show for a longer period? Well, this would only work with gardens, but as Christine says, it would certainly not work with the nursery stands. But perhaps there's something a little bit more on the show Marcel Loire.
There are a couple of problems with that. A is that you can't keep the site for too long because the Chelsea commissioners live.
It is a public. At the end of the day, it's a public park.
It's fair enough.
And there's other things that come through and need to be. And as Christine so rightly says, it's pretty damn difficult to keep a display going for 5 days on a hot. I mean, imagine what the temperature would be like today.
Yes.
In the pavilion is not much fun, particularly people with sort of cut flowers or bulbs or anything like that. So no, we would. I mean, 5 days is longer than it was when you and I started going. Noel, definitely. And so it would be really difficult to make it run any longer, and it would be impossible because the cost would escalate.
And the balance. If you go back to we talked about the garden festivals. They tried to do a flower show within the garden festival. So the garden festival ran for a whole summer, and then they had a marquee garden show in that. And the hybrid didn't really work. My husband was very involved with all that, and it just really didn't work.
Nick Aikman is saying, is anyone else underwhelmed by virtual Chelsea, or am I missing something? I don't know what people think about that. I actually found it quite nice last night, looking back at some of the gardens and thinking, oh yeah, that was a goodie. But I don't know what the general feeling is if people have been or are aware of virtual Chelsea or have been tuning in. But I don't know.
Annie, you're talking about BBC coverage or virtual Chelsea?
Well, I think they're saying virtual Chelsea, so yes, I guess there is a distinction.
Two, isn't it? Yeah.
I think the virtual Chelsea is interesting in that it is the RHS has been essentially forced to change as this whole crisis is making all of us
change our business model. I mean, you know, why am I sitting here in front of my laptop on a Sunday afternoon? I've changed my business model, and I think this could be. I think some really fantastic things could come out of this. The RHS thinking about how to get this celebration of horticulture out there in ways that are in many ways much more sustainable. I mean, I myself look forward to future perhaps kind of semi-virtual Chelseas. I mean, it's there's been an enormous spike of people visiting the RHS website because of it, more so than great in a normal Chelsea, obviously. So that's attracting people to the charity, and memberships are being sold and all of this kind of stuff, which is, you know. Well, I did watch Rosie Hardy yesterday talking about plants and the plants that she would have been exhibiting on the stand, and I thought that was very good. Yes. Yeah. I mean, there are a lot of good films. I mean, bearing in mind that all these films are made they're self-shot by people on their telephones and sort of cobbled together. I've done one in my garden for tomorrow, and it's sort of, oh my God, how the hell do we do this? How do we make this sort of work? And then I worked out that my brother was much better at this than I was, and so he did it, so it's fab. So it is a sort of DIY thing, Virtual Chelsea, and it was being put together very, very fast in order to satisfy what people want. They still want to feel that Chelsea is still out there. They still want to be part of horticulture at this time. And particularly the other thing that has come up from lockdown is the number of people who have taken up gardening. Yeah. Oh, that's fantastic. Absolutely. Yes. So I think the legacy of this will be very, very good in that way. Talking of the legacy.
No, well, I think James has just answered what your initial question was. Yeah. Has Chelsea past its sell-by date? Obviously, for the number of people going to the virtual Chelsea, no.
I think turning into something else. Yeah. Actually, that's a very good point, Chris and James, and you were making now. And what I'd like to ask is, next year, hopefully we'll have the normal Chelsea, but will we also have a virtual Chelsea as well? Will that become a perennial feature as well, which people will expect and become almost as important? And so that would then have a capacity to actually make it much more global, especially if there's a lot of serious horticultural and design content, not just kind of media hype. And that's the absolutely, just as we've Garden Masterclass has been forced to go global, which has been a great thing. That there could be a more global vision of Chelsea as well, which is a very positive development. One thing about global involvement in Chelsea, going back to people submitting garden designs, they can come from anywhere. They can come from anywhere in the world. We're looking actively for designers, not just in Britain, but from anywhere, from Paraguay or Papua New Guinea or Portugal or wherever. There is no limit on this. So people need to apply if they want to have a garden at one of the RHS shows. Ask. Yes. Yeah. Great. I think that's possibly a good note on which to end an open invitation. Thank you, James, very much for joining us. Thank you, Christine, for there's a particularly wonderful kind of historical, if you don't mind my saying historical perspective. Duncan, thank you very much for your views. And joining us from Germany. And I mustn't forget my collaborator, Annie.
Well, we've had lots of people saying thank you, super interesting, lively, and enjoying. Thanks to all involved, very interesting stuff.
And I'm going to flag up tomorrow being Wednesday. We've got an interesting sort of compare and contrast, haven't we?
Possibly, yes. Yeah, we're going across. What's coming up for the rest of this week? Well, just dropping a few hints. We're across the pond again tomorrow. And then for the rest of the week, we will be visiting one of the most beautiful Mediterranean islands with an incredibly talented gardener. And then another day, we've had to delve into our contacts to find somebody to fill a gap. So yeah, stay tuned.